for having me. No, it's really interesting. I suppose of all the talks, the one that is probably the oddest is the one on medieval sermons, right? I can imagine people might be thinking, why would I listen to something about medieval sermons? Well, all I can say about that is I find them interesting. I've written about them, obviously, but also it's the method of preaching. Actually, what I'm going to talk about today is more just the preaching of Thomas Aquinas. But once you understand how Thomas Aquinas does it, he uses a style which is characteristic of the 13th century. It's called the modern sermon style, actually, as opposed to the older sermon style. And it's a kind of interesting way of doing sermons. Anyway, and so I will always say to those who are tuning in that once you listen to this lecture, you will know something that very few people in the world know. Actually, very few people in the world know how to read a medieval sermon or a modern sermon. Not that people haven't read them, but they just don't quite understand how it works. Anyway, and you will know actually how it works. All right, so let's get started. Let me see So look, it's strange to think that Thomas Aquinas' sermons have garnered so little attention over the years, especially since he was a member of the self-identified order of preachers. I suppose we can say, the Dominicans still claim him, so maybe we can say he is a member of the self-identified order of preachers, which was a group, after all, that defined itself precisely by its preaching. And as a master of the sacred page at Paris, one of Thomas's official duties, along with lecturing on the Bible and doing disputed questions, was preaching. Both of the great Summae, as well as all of his commentaries on the text of Aristotle, were products of Thomas's spare time, whereas his preaching was something that he was required to do as a master. And yet it's only now, some 135 years after Pope Leo XIII's original commission to the Dominican order to produce critical editions of all of the works of St. Thomas, that a modern critical edition of Thomas's extant sermons, done by the late Father Louis Bataillon, is finally completed. It was completed about 2 years ago, and finally, showed up in our library by the Leonine Commission. Right, the Pope Leo XIII began, or he called upon the Dominicans to do this, and so that's why we call this group that publishes the works of Thomas in modern critical editions the Leonine Commission. And also we have, thankfully, and it showed up actually shortly before the critical edition, a translation, an English translation of all the extant sermons produced by Father Mark Robert Hoagland, and it appeared in the Catholic University of America press series, The Fathers of the Church, Medieval Continuation. Okay, so you can actually get there's only 21 extant sermons by Thomas Aquinas that we have at all, actually. There used to be a great number more, but in fact, a lot of them were false, right? And so there's only 19 actually, the 21, actually of only 19 are full. A couple of them are actually only partial reportatios or reports of Thomas's sermons. So anyway, now we're with reading, but be forewarned, even the devoted fans of Aquinas may find the sermon something of an odd read. Although in his biblical commentaries, Thomas is noteworthy for his devotion to the literal sense of the text, yet in his sermons, he seems to garner all sorts of odd interpretations from just one or two words in the biblical text he seems to be commenting on. Consider, for example, Sermon 16. Sometimes the sermons go by the number, oftentimes they go by the first words in the sermon, which is in Veni David, right? I found David. So in Veni David, Sermon 16, which is based on the passage from Psalm 88:21 that reads, I have found David my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him. My hand will assist him, and my arm will make him firm. In the body of the sermon, we find Thomas claiming that, quote, from these words, we can learn 4 praiseworthy things of this holy bishop, St. Nicholas, because it was on Nicholas's feast day that the sermon was preached. So Thomas thinks from the words that he just read, I have found David, my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him, my hand will assist him, etc., etc. He says, we can find 4 praiseworthy things of this holy bishop, St. Nicholas. First, his wondrous election. as bishop. Second, his unique consecration. Third, the effective execution of his task. And fourth, his immovable and firm stability. His wondrous election, says Thomas, is shown in the words, I have found David, my servant. His special consecration is shown in the words, I have anointed him with my sacred oil. The effective execution of his, Nicholas's task, is shown by the words, my hand will help him, and his stable firmness is shown where it says, and my arm will make him firm. What Thomas's exegesis of the biblical text seems to be suggesting, therefore, is that the psalmist, who lives around the year 1000 BC, or maybe 800 BC, right, depending upon the psalm, is neither referring to David in this psalm, even though the psalm literally says, I have found David my servant, nor even to Christ, which you might think by means of an allegorical understanding of David. No, as it turns out, the psalmist, Thomas seems to be suggesting, is actually referring to the 4th century AD saint Nicholas of Myra. At this point, even devoted fans of Aquinas may feel that Thomas is guilty of eisegesis, right, reading meaning into the text rather than exegesis, that is, transporting meanings out of the text. Rather, he's transporting meanings into it rather than digging meanings out of it. Modern biblical exegetes, one hardly need to add, would certainly be inclined to draw that conclusion. But that judgment is, I would suggest, the result of what philosophers sometimes call a category mistake. That is to say, it is a result of an unfortunate misunderstanding of the purpose served by the opening biblical epigraph in Thomas's sermons. Because in fact, a diligent reading of Thomas's sermons will show that the biblical verse that stands at the beginning of the text served as a unique mnemonic device, a memory aid, which allowed the listeners to remember more easily the material covered in the sermon. As author Mary Carruthers has noted in her fine study, The Book of Memory, a study of memory in medieval culture, she says, quote, medieval culture was fundamentally memorial to the same profound degree that modern culture in the West is documentary. Thus, medieval scholars prized mnemonic devices to the same degree that modern scholars prize a thorough index, a good annotated bibliography, or a complete analytical concordance. Ancient and medieval people reserved their awe for memory, says Ms. Carruthers, and their greatest geniuses they describe as people of superior memories. And they regard it as a mark of superior moral character as well as intellect. They would not, moreover, she insists, have understood our separation of memory from learning. In their understanding of the matter, it was memory that made knowledge into useful experience, and memory that combined these disparate bits of information become experience into concrete moral judgments. Indeed, one of the great paradigmatic figures of this memory culture in the Middle Ages was Thomas Aquinas, of whom it was reported, this is one of the famous stories about Thomas, that he was able to dictate to 3 secretaries, and even occasionally to 4, on different subjects at the same time, much as modern chess masters sometimes will play 4 or 5, games of chess going back and forth between them. In her wonderful book, Carruthers compares this ability to dictate to several scribes at once with a memory device developed decades earlier by Hugh St. Victor, whereby the novice could learn several psalms at once in such a way as to be able to move back and forth easily from any one place in one psalm to any place in any of the others. The fundamental principle, she says, is to divide the material to be remembered into pieces short enough to be recalled in single units, and to key these units into some sort of rigid, easily reconstructible order. We will see a similar practice when we come to Thomas's use of the opening biblical epigraph. The use of such memory devices, as Carruthers thoroughly documents in her wonderful book, were a standard part of the basic medieval pedagogy in the language arts. The opening biblical verse that prefaces Thomas's sermons, then, is not exactly the text to be preached on, at least not in the sense of doing some sort of exegesis of the text as we understand it in the modern world. It is rather a verbal mnemonic device, as I've suggested, which is systematically key to the material in the sermon. Allow me to illustrate with an example. If you find the sermon Ecce Rex Tuus listed in Hoagland's translation, it will be listed as Sermon 5. You will find that the sermon is prefaced with the Latin verse, Ecce Rex Tuus venit tibi mansuetus. In English, behold, your king comes to you, meek. Now, the whole verse, some of you may recognize as something that's Palm Sunday, behold, your king comes to you meek and riding on a donkey. This is a passage from the prophet Zechariah, which is quoted in Matthew's gospel during Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Matthew 21:6. You can also see Zechariah 9:9. The casual reader might be tempted to think, with some justification, here is a verse that deals with Jesus' coming into Jerusalem. The sermon is supposed to deal with Jesus' coming at Advent, was an Advent sermon. So clearly, we assume the sermon will take its theme from and perhaps be a commentary on this biblical verse, right? Behold, your king comes to you meek. Just as Jesus came triumphantly into Jerusalem, we expect Thomas to say, so also he will come triumphantly at the end of time. Indeed, if we had some experience with patristic or early medieval biblical commentaries, we might even be expecting all sorts of allegories on, for example, the palm branches, the donkey, the city of Jerusalem, and perhaps various other elements of the story. But that's not what happens at all. Rather, we will be much more open to what Thomas actually accomplishes in this sermon if we keep those things that I just mentioned out of our minds and focus instead on the passage precisely as a mnemonic device. In Sermon 5, after a brief introduction and prayer, which is very common in these sermons, sometimes there's actually a whole other little set before you get to this part. But anyway, after a brief introduction and prayer, Thomas repeats the opening epigraph, behold, your king comes to you meek. That would, of course, he would say in Latin. But anyway, after that, and tells his listener, quote, in these words, the coming of Christ is clearly foretold to us. Which again, you might say, well, okay, that fits with the words. But then after a brief discussion of the 4 different advents of Christ, the one in which he came in the flesh, the one by which he comes into our minds, the one in which he comes at death, at the death of the just, and the one in which he will come at the end of time in judgment. The importance of distinguishing these 4 will become clear in a moment. So after distinguishing those 4, Thomas continues as follows. And the first advent of Christ is touched upon in the aforementioned words, in which we can see 4 things. First, a demonstration of the coming of Christ, where it says, behold. Second, the condition of his coming, where it says, your king. Third, the humility of his coming, where it says meek. And fourth, the utility of his coming, for you. That would, of course, be the word order in Latin. In what follows, Thomas begins first, naturally enough, with unfolding the points he wishes to associate with the word behold. There are 4 different things we can understand when we use the behold, says Thomas. First, when we use the word behold, we can be asserting something of which we are certain, as in, behold, I bring you tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. Now, says Thomas, quote, just as some people doubted concerning the first coming of the Lord, so also some doubt concerning his second coming at the end of time. And yet, in the psalm, it assures us, surely the Lord will come, Psalm 96. So in order to reassure those who fear that the soul will not survive death, the opening biblical verse from Zechariah announces, behold, your king comes to you. Next, when we say behold, says Thomas, we might be indicating a determination of time, as in, behold, my hour is come. So, quote, although the time of Christ's coming at the final judgment is not at a time determined for us to know, because God wished us to always be vigilant in good works, yet his coming in the flesh was at a determined time, and so the text says, behold. Thirdly, when we say behold, we can be indicating the manifestation of a thing, as for example, when John the Baptist points at Jesus and says, behold, the Lamb of God. So then, although the coming of Christ into the mind is hidden, yet Christ's coming in the flesh was manifest and visible, so the verse says, behold, your king comes to you. And fourth, when we use the word behold, we can be using it for the strengthening of men, and this in 2 circumstances. First, when they have won victory over their enemies, as in, behold, the day has come which I desire, my enemies appear before me. And second, when they have attained the good, as in, behold how good the Lord is. And, says Thomas, since we have obtained both of these things in the coming of Christ, namely have peace and victory over the enemy, and we have joy from the hope obtained of future goods, so the prophet says, behold. Now, having finished with behold in its 4 senses, right? Oddly, but interestingly, Thomas turns next to the words, your king, which he says shows the condition of Christ's coming. Now, a person's coming is awaited with solemnity for 2 reasons, says Thomas, either because of his greatness, if, for example, he is a king, or because of a special love, if, for example, he is an intimate friend. Thus the word your. But Christ was coming as both king and friend, thus the combination your king. Since the Latin rex tuus, whereas since the Latin is rex tuus, where in English we say your king, Thomas is focused first on the things that follow from Christ being a king, rex, and then later takes up the things that follow from Christ being our friend, which follows from the word tuus, or your. First then, a king, says Thomas, suggests unity. Second, he has fullness of power. Third, he has an abundant jurisdiction. And fourth, a king brings equity of justice. With regard to the first, there must be unity for there to be kingship. Otherwise, if there were many, dominion would not pertain to any one of them. Thus, we must reject Arius, says Thomas, quote, who is positing many gods, saying that the Son was other than the Father. Second, Christ is king in that he has fullness of power. Thus, laws are not imposed on him. Rather, he has authority over the law, which is why he can say in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, you have heard it said of old, but I say to you, as if to say, I am the true king who can establish the law for you. Third, Christ has an abundance to his jurisdiction in that whereas other kings have dominion over this town or those cities, all creatures have been made subject to Christ. Fourth, Christ brings equity of justice in that whereas tyrants submit all things for the sake of their own utility, Christ orders all things to the common good. It is in all these ways, concludes Thomas, that Christ comes for you, venit tibi in Latin. And with this, the sermon ends, or at least seems to. But we know, if we've been paying attention, that Thomas has not yet finished unpacking. The technical term in Latin is actually dilatatio, the root of our word dilation. So let us say Thomas has not yet finished dilating, okay, expanding his opening verse from the Gospel of Matthew, ecce rex tuus venit tibi mensuetus, right? He's only finished with the words ecce and rex, but he still needs to deal with tuus venit tibi and mensuetus. And indeed, since this was a university sermon, and preachers giving university sermons at the University of Paris were required by statute to give a collatio, a collation, another address, at Vespers later that same night. And they were required by university statute to use the same thema verse, which is that same Bible verse at the beginning. If we look at the collatio that comes after this sermon, we will find the same epigraph, ecce rex tuus venit tibi mensuetus, after which Thomas gives a brief summary of his earlier sermon, her sermon from earlier that day, and without losing a beat, picks up right where he left off with tuus, your king. Note that Thomas is able to pick up right where he left off without missing a beat, as I put it, precisely because his mnemonic device allows him to locate his exact position in the sentence, review quickly the material already covered in the morning by correlating it to the keywords ecce and rex, and then proceed on with his collatio according to its original plan. Now, I don't have space here. We don't want to take the time necessarily here to recount in detail the rest of Thomas's parsing of the verse. But those who are interested can see the substance of it if you look at my book, right, where I've written about this. I'm sorry for the little thing on the book. Usually I have a handout for people. But anyway, very briefly, it looks something like this. Christ is our king, your king, right? Our king, because of the similitude of image between him and man, okay? Because of his special love for man, because of his solicitude and singular care for man, and finally, because of his conformity or society with our human nature. That's our king. He comes for us, says Thomas, to manifest to us his divine majesty, to reconcile us to God, from whom through sin we were estranged as enemies, to liberate us from servitude to sin, and finally to give us grace in the present and glory in the future. Finally, meekness. His meekness is shown in the meekness of his conversation, in his gentle correction of others, in his gracious acceptance of men, not only the just, but also sinners, and in his passion, obviously, to which he was led as a lamb. And all of that, Thomas is able to pack into his discussion about just those few words. Now, If we mistakenly thought Thomas was attempting an exegesis of the biblical verse, "Behold, your king comes for you meek and riding on a donkey," we might indeed be a bit skeptical that he could have really found all this theology in just this one sentence. Again, with modern biblical critics, we might be tempted to say that Thomas is simply reading meanings into the text that he wants to find there, not deriving literal meaning from the text. But if we realize that the opening biblical verse is really an ingenious verbal mnemonic, everything changes. Think about how much the listener can recollect, and think about it in yourself, right? Just by remembering one sentence. "Behold" reminds us, of the four manifestations of Christ's coming in the flesh, in the mind of each person, to the just at the time of their death, and as the judge at the end of time. "Your king" reminds us of the condition of his coming, his unity with God the Father. He has fullness of power, he has dominion over all, and he brings equity of justice. The word "your" additionally reminds us of the similitude of image between him and man, his special love for man, his solicitude and singular care for man, and his conformity with our human nature. The words "for you" remind us of the utility of his coming, to manifest to us his divine majesty, to reconcile us to God, from whom through sin we were estranged as enemies, to liberate us from servitude to sin, and to give us grace in the present and glory in the future. And the word "meek" finally reminds us of the manner of his coming. He showed meekness in his conversation, in his gentle correction of others, in his gracious acceptance of men, not only the just but sinners, and in his passion, to which he was led meekly like a lamb. Each word in the sentence is a verbal cue meant to help bring to mind the content Thomas wishes to teach. To recollect the content, one need only begin by bringing to mind the one sentence, and the rest will spill out naturally. That's the idea about recollection. You have little bits and pieces, and then as you recall, as you know the word, right, you remember, you recollect all the information he gave you. Now, although many of us in the modern world might find Thomas's sermon style a bit odd, right? I totally understand that. Yet by the same token, for those who prefer short, compact, and yet doctrinally rich sermons over long, flowery speeches that go on for an hour or more, Thomas's sermons might seem like a godsend, just on that basis alone. Sit and listen for 10 minutes, and you still go out with enough food for thought to keep you busy reflecting for days. If done well, these sermons exhibited the skills of a speaker who had to be smart, clever, and highly efficient. Characteristics the increasingly urbane medieval townspeople who had to listen to them understood and respected. It's not that the busy townspeople of the Middle Ages didn't want holiness. It's simply that, as a general rule, they wanted their holiness delivered in packages that were smart, clever, and highly efficient. They didn't have the patience of medieval monks, necessarily. Thus, although it may seem a bit odd to us, Thomas's sermon style was actually considered thoroughly modern for its time. Indeed, this style of sermon, as I mentioned before, was actually called a modern sermon, sermo modernus, as opposed to the sermo antiquus style that involved a verse-by-verse commentary on the entire gospel. And it was a style of preaching that became very popular in the mid-13th century. John of Wales, a Franciscan master of Paris around 1270, wrote in his De Arte Predicandi, on the art of preaching, for example, that the older Sermo Antiquus style homily, quote, did not sit particularly well with modern listeners, who liked to see the clear articulation of a sermon develop from a scriptural thema. Again, the thema verse is that one sentence at the beginning. And the Italian Dominican Fra Giacomo di Fusignano, prior of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, writes in 1290 that the old style was suitable only for preaching to the ignorant. The type of sermon, quote, more common to modern preachers, says Giacomo, was the sort we have seen St. Thomas preach in which an opening biblical theme was divided into various parts. In the modern sermon, the preacher would start by stating his thema, biblical verse, and after a brief introduction or prothema, introducing a prayer, he would then restate his thema and proceed to divide the opening verse into several parts, each of which was in turn associated with a separate section or member of the sermon. Indeed, this announcement of the skeleton of the sermon at the outset is the hallmark of the style, the technical term for which was the declaration of parts. The preacher would then expand upon each of these parts in turn, keeping the order of his presentation clear by continuing to return to the words of the opening biblical thema. Among the authors of the major medieval preaching manuals, the thema, that is the opening biblical verse, was often likened either to the root of a tree or to the trunk from which sprung the various branches. Usually the thema verse was taken from one of the specified biblical readings for the day. Choosing the right thema verse from the daily readings was crucial, given that the entire content of the sermon had to be unfolded from or associated with the words of that biblical verse. Along with figuring out which verse to choose, the two key skills involved in crafting medieval sermons were divisio and dilatatio. Divisio, namely the art of making a perspicacious division of the thema into parts that could be developed organically in the body of the sermon. And dilatatio, the art of unpacking or unfolding each of these parts in such a way as to provide suitable content for the sermon, right? Dilation. The preaching manuals of the 13th and early 14th centuries describe dozens of possible ways of doing both of these things, all of which I detail in my book, by the way, but we don't really have time to go into them. I mean, there's a lot of ways of doing this. One of the great benefits of the sermon modernist style of preaching, however, was that it turned one or more of the biblical verses specified by the lectionary for a specific liturgical day into the means for what in the classical rhetorical tradition would have been called inventio, that is, finding and developing one's topic, dispositio, organizing one's material, and memoria, the remembering of one's material. These are classical rhetorical ideas, right? You had to find your material, you had to organize the material, and you had to memorize the material, and then you had to present it. Indeed, I would argue, and I have argued in my book, that what we have been exploring here was a new sort of rhetoric, one that constituted a significant development on the classical rhetorical tradition that had been handed down to the Middle Ages by the likes of Cicero and Quintilian. This new rhetoric of the Middle Ages was in fact a rhetoric of preaching, a rhetoric based on scripture and directed toward the goal of helping people hear the word of God more effectively in order to live it more faithfully. As is well known, the three duties of the medieval master in sacred theology were to preach, predicare, to give disputations, disputare, and to provide a cursory reading of the scriptures for his students, legere, or lectio. Note that in choosing to preach as he does, Thomas succeeds in not confusing the role of preaching, predicandi, with the medieval practice of reading, legendi. Legere, reading, involves the teacher giving the students a good first reading of the text by means of a line-by-line commentary. When engaged in preaching, however, the preacher condenses all that learning into a much more abbreviated sort of presentation, imparting knowledge to the congregation in a manner suited to their abilities to recollect it should the need arise. What they retain in their immediate memory, of course, is merely the passage from Scripture, which, by the way, if they were monks or friars, they should have already committed to memory. Thereafter, though, if they can call to mind the text, right, the epigraph, the thema, they can then more easily recollect the different elements of the sermon. I actually, when I give this lecture, I call the talk Mixing Memory and Desire in the title. Because for one thing, it's part of a famous line from the beginning of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, a reference that I thought might make the title of the talk more memorable for some listeners. But I've also used it because I believe that Thomas understands something about delivering sermons that many who preach tend to forget, namely that to have a lasting impact on the life of the listener, the substance of the sermon must be remembered past the moment when the sermon is delivered. Many can dazzle with displays of rhetorical fury. Few can preach in such a way as to impress the thoughts on the mind of the listener, like a seal into soft wax. In the long run, we have to ask, which is more effective? Dom Jean Leclerc entitled his famous book on monastic culture, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. It has often been said of the biblical sermons of St. Bernard that they were excellent at enkindling in listeners the desire for God. St. Thomas's way of preaching is different, no doubt, but no less biblical. And indeed, as examples of how to mix learning and the desire for God, they are, I would suggest, no less effective. Thomas is one of the medieval pioneers, along with others, but, he's one of the major people, one of the medieval pioneers of a new rhetoric, a rhetoric of the mind, a rhetoric attuned not only to the rhythms and cadences that stir the passions, but also to the patterns and structures that inform the mind and human memory. Thank you very much.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Really, really a lot to think about. So, you have time for a few questions?
Of course.
Okay. All right. So first, you mentioned the ancient method of preaching, and you mentioned the modern method of preaching, which of course was the medieval method. I mean,
right.
How would you describe today's method of preaching, and what are the strengths and weaknesses, and what does St. Thomas? You mentioned this a little bit, but maybe you could expand. What does this medieval style of preaching have to give us as far as a corrective?
Yeah, right. Everybody, that's always the first question I get. When I gave a similar talk in Utrecht, and the auxiliary bishop of the Netherlands, said, yeah, what can this teach? Like, what am I supposed to tell my priests about preaching, et cetera, et cetera? And the first thing I always say is, well, look, I think this is a really clever, interesting way of doing things. I wouldn't be recommending it as a way that modern preachers could preach. Although, once they sort of studied a little bit and got used to it, I think they would say to themselves, dang, this really organizes, it gives me every student always says, oh, I don't know what to write about. And so, well, this gives you the idea of what to write about, organizes it for you, and then helps it be something which is memorable for the people you're preaching to, right? That's just part of the stuff. So it has its benefits. One might say about modern preaching, other than it's chaotic, right? It's a kind of, a mess, right? I'm not saying anything, at least in the United States, right? It's a great scandal, it seems to me, that the preaching, if you go to Calvinist church, you go to some of our Protestant brethren and you hear preaching, real biblical preaching, at a very high level, if you get one of these guys, he was like John Henry Newman or something like that, and he was trained as an Anglican, but you go there and you hear this sort of preaching. And then you come to a Catholic church, you're like, wow, we are really terrible at this, right? And we shouldn't be. But we don't really train our people to do it well. So this is chaotic. So it's a combination of a mishmash, little personal stories, little pious stories, and be nice kind of stuff in modern sermons. So it's largely and of course the thing I always ask people to ask themselves is, when they leave the church, how much of the sermon do they remember? Like, they just walk out the door and say two things. I said this to the auxiliary bishop. I said, so when people walk out of the church, how much could they recollect? How much do they remember at all about what the priest preached on that day, right? And they go, he said something about, he was talking and the other thing is, what was the gospel? If you don't somehow preach in such a way that the people who are listening actually remember, in the modern world, like the gospel, the epistle, the Old Testament, they somehow have no remembrance of what was the gospel today? You failed. I just think you've just utterly, utterly failed. I don't care whether you have do you remember that wonderful story Father told? No, I don't. I do, and I don't care, right? If you don't mention the scriptures, then you've utterly failed. Now, look, the other reason we can't preach the way Thomas preaches, the lessons you would learn, John, would be something like this. Got to prepare. If you're going to preach this way, you can't ad hoc it, right? You got to go off and you got to prepare it. All right. You got to look at the readings. You got to set it out. It takes time to do this. And when you do it and do it well, it's clever, and it's really packed, right? These weren't notes. This is the way Thomas preached. So you get, really, in 10 minutes, you get this amazing, it takes me longer to talk about it than it did for Thomas to preach. It's amazingly compact, and it can be, in the Latin, amazingly beautifully rendered, almost like a piece of poetry. You have to understand these parallel phrases that Thomas uses. He's not as good at it as Bonaventure is. Bonaventure's rendering of this stuff is on the verge of poetry. He can get all these parallel phrases to be exactly parallel and to scan and rhyme. It's a masterstroke. I mean, people can do this well. Everybody just obviously is like, this guy's amazing. But there's still, it doesn't get in the way of, serious, rigorous teaching, both moral and doctrinal. So that's a virtue. But our thing that we're supposed to be doing in the modern world, modern preaching, that nobody actually does, the lectionary has been changed. And so if you were going to get effective preaching, the lectionary is set up so that the Old Testament reading is coordinated with the New Testament reading. And so the Old Testament reading and the Psalm are coordinated with the Gospel, and then you're sort of working your way through various Pauline epistles. And what almost always gets laughed out are the Pauline epistles, unfortunately. So maybe we need to rethink that. But what it's set up for the preacher to then very clearly sort of be able to mention the relationship, the Old Testament, New Testament, the Psalm beautifully connecting the two, etc. And it's just frittered away repeatedly. No one ever does that. But the point is, you wouldn't preach Thomas's way because the lectionary is different. And the lectionary has been set up to help people, to know what to preach about and to be able to prepare and do a little exegesis, as it were, and show how the Old Testament and the Psalm and bring out the beauty. And again, it's like, look, you got to prepare, you got to work on this thing. You can't just come in and even if you prepare and you spend all week working on your homily and nobody can remember what the scripture readings were and nobody can remember what you said, I think you failed, right? So anyway, that's what I would say about
Well,
that.
you took the second question, and I was thinking about that as well. It's interesting. I mean, you just get the feeling, like, we can just say this because so many of us agree. I read a poll not too long ago. This was a legitimate poll. A full 40% of Catholic Sunday Mass goers think their liturgical music is quote unquote awful. 40%. Yeah. So we can, and I think they probably, in terms of those who think that homiletics really has a lot of improvement to make, it probably wouldn't be far off 40%, and you get the feeling that a lot, in many cases, there's just simply no preparation at all. I mean, it's just kind of, or a minimal preparation. Right. And I was thinking, as you were saying this, I mean, the amount of the hours of preparation that must have gone into this. Of course, they've got trained minds and they're good at this, but right? I mean, it's.
Yeah, I think actually that when you get good at it, it's easier than you would think, actually. I mean, you have to be kind of clever, but look, it's the kind of thing that appeals to people who love words and love word games, right? And puzzles. So I don't consider myself a big, proponent of that, or, I've never, but it is quite ingenious in ways. Because what you have is these lists of things. So you can look there's concordances and things that can help you with all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that's big is that you can actually look in a certain kind of thing called, they're called biblical distincciones, like distinctions. And they're not distinctions like you would get in the Summa. You have a word, okay? And the most famous one of these is called the Summa Abel, the Summa Abel, right? Because the first word, it's just done alphabetically, and the first word in this text is Abel. And it goes through, and for every word, it lists out, like 10 possible, sort of ways you could use that word to emphasize. So for example, one of the famous examples is obvious, eagle. And you can either take eagle to be something noble, and so you could have the eagle represent something noble in your sermon, or the eagle is something which is clawing, people and killing animals or something like that. Or the eagle, you could say, has tremendous perceptive sight. Anyway, you can look up and you can see all these sorts of meanings in Abbas is actually just bird, so I'm sorry, I'm mistaking it for another one. But so you can take about a bird being in a bush, and that could be a bishop lost in, all the mess of being a bishop. You could take bird as flying in the sky. You could talk bird about, being in the winter. Anyway, you can do all these things with this imagery. This is a culture that really likes words and is very attentive in a way that I don't think people have understood. Very attentive to imagery and the potentials for every word to have multiple meanings. That's why I think actually this there's a crossover back and forth between what you see in the disputed questions and what you see here in the sermons and what you see in the biblical commentary. But let's leave that aside for the time being. Namely, Thomas is very good, and a lot of the medievals are very good at saying, well, you see this one word, in one sense, yes, in one sense, no, right? Or we could have three different senses of this word, and then we could understand it in very similar ways. Well, that's what they're doing all the time when they're preaching, right? It's kind of like, I could take that word, I could mean it this, or I could take that word and I could use it that way, right? To indicate something else. And the imagery can get quite complicated and quite beautiful. Which, again, if you know, John, that like people think about Bernard of Clairvaux and all his marvelous imagery, and of course it's true, but then you get to somebody like Bonaventure and it's much more scholastic, ordered, but the imagery is similarly very elaborate and quite beautiful sometimes.
That's interesting. As you were talking, I couldn't help but think of Joseph Pieper's description of even, kind of disputatio in the Middle Ages. And you just think, it was such a rigorous age. And we think of it as, well, that's the bad old days when life was, short and brutish. And it's just this incredible attention to detail, in terms of, the rhetoric and imagery and everything, Okay, somebody on Facebook wants to know the title of your book. So it is, I will say, so there's three books, but the one I think you're thinking of is Aquinas, Bonaventure, and the Scholastic Culture of Medieval Paris.
Actually, they're probably, if you're interested in Thomas's sermons,
okay,
and you're interested in a book that's like affordable, relatively,
is the Cambridge
then you
book
want the Reading the Sermons of Thomas Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide.
Okay,
right. Reading the sermons through Emmaus Press.
And after you finish that, then you can do the Cambridge volume, and you can dig into to an academically priced volume.
The Cambridge volume talks about the development of this and traces its development through the prologues of. It's sort of interesting. Let me just say something about that, really quickly, because what happens is that. When you became a master at the University of Paris, you had to give what was called a principium address, your first. And it was usually given in the aula, the hall of the bishop. And so it was called a principium and aula. And then after that, like several days later, you would had to give what was called a resumptio, right? So you had to resume whatever. And the first talk was supposed to be about it always to be in praise of scripture as opposed to other disciplines. And then the second talk, by regulation, was to be a divisiones of all the books, another praise of scripture, but then with a division of all the books of the Bible into these various ways. But in any case, the idea of this, seems to me, I've argued, is that this is what masters were always supposed to do. So anytime they had masters in theology, anytime you had a course, so you would say, like Thomas did his course where he's lecturing on his lectio, right? The book of the Gospel of Matthew. Well, there's a scribe who's taking down all this stuff, and he's worked it out and whatever. But the first lecture he would give and the first day of class was given in the style of these sermons, right? This sermon modernist style. And he would give this protreptic prologue, sort of like to the class, explaining why the Gospel of Matthew is so important, why Matthew is important, who he is, et cetera, et cetera. And it was always delivered in this same style, right? It was something which was required at the University of Paris to be able to do this. And then when the book was published, if the book got published, like we have Thomas's commentary on Matthew, we have Thomas's commentaries on the letters to St. Paul and stuff like that, then that opening lecture became the prologue to the book. Right? So there's a relationship between writing prologues, and sermons, right? Every prologue to a kind of way of saying every prologue to a book in this period was basically a sermon.
So was Thomas's first lecture, did that end up being the prologue to Matthew, to his commentary on Matthew?
So if you read the prologue to the Gospel of Matthew, you will realize, oh, it's weird. Like there's one biblical verse not from the book of Matthew, and then he does this weird thing with it. And the point is, yes, it's a sermon, right? Yeah. And so all he's doing is doing exactly what I just showed you how to do, right? You just have to look through and go, okay, here's the first word or couple words, and that's associated with the first part of the sermon. The second word in the phrase is the second part of the sermon, the third word of the phrase. And he's just making all these associations, which are weird associations, like the word behold. Who would have thought you could get the four advents of Christ out of the word behold. You would have thought, behold, your king comes to you, that he would have associated the comings of Christ in Advent with the word comes. But he associates all the four Advents with the word behold. But it's memorable, right? The weirder it is, actually, you start to realize, this is something that shows up in Carruthers' Book of Memory. The weirder the association, sometimes the easier it is to memorize it. So in the notes on the piano, for example, the little thing E, G, B, D, F, people remember every good boy does fine, right? And the point is like, what does that even mean? I mean, like, why is that a memory? And the point is, because it's weird, but it helps people remember, right? These are the way mnemonic devices operate. And in the Middle Ages, they loved mnemonic devices. Many people don't talk about that, but yeah. Carruthers is right. The reason Thomas is considered the great genius that he is, he's the Einstein of his period. And this is an interesting thing to notice as a paradigm. Einstein is considered a great genius by us because he was creative, right? He came up with E equals mc squared. He thought about, a relativity theory, okay? General relativity, etc., right? Okay. And whereas Thomas is considered a genius because he could dictate to four scribes at once. Yeah. And he could remember, everything he ever read. And they thought that was like just amazing. And it is amazing. Einstein's amazing too. But anyway, that's the paradigm.
All right. Dr. Smith, we're not going to let you go yet. We got a few more questions here. Okay. Let's see. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. This is from Michael. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Who were Thomas's? So there's a few questions here. I'm going to break these up. So who were Thomas's intended hearers for this sermon? Number one, were these the same hearers who were to hear the continuation of his sermon during Vespers? And also, were these sermons collected by Thomas himself or cataloged by other? So I just gave you three questions. So we're going to see how good
they're all very good questions.
No, we're going to see how good your memory is.
Yeah. Answer to one, there's some dispute about it. It's very clear with this sermon, because it has a collatio, that it was a university sermon. Okay. So you're likely going to have, university students who are going to be attending, which is going to mean like a lot of Dominicans and Franciscans and stuff, and people who are training to be preachers themselves. So in other words, let me back off from that and just simply say a lot of people who are going to be more educated. But one of the disputes then, why this is a good question, is could it possibly have been the case that these sermons, this kind of, sort of complicated mnemonic device kind of sermon, was something that was preached to the regular laity? And the answer is, as far as we can tell, yes. And again, from the stuff I gave you, the quotations from John of Wales and Giacomo, of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, sopra Minerva. This seems to have been very popular. It seemed to, and everything we can tell from manuscript stuff is like this kind of sermon kind of pushed out the old style sermon. This was the way most people did it. It seems, right? Again, we underestimate the degree to which an audience or a congregation can be learned or literary without being literate. In other words, they don't necessarily read all the time. Again, anybody knows anything about Ireland in the early 20th century, it was a very literary culture, but not necessarily a very literate culture. And in other words, they didn't have people who did necessarily a lot of reading, but they knew a lot of stories and they had a lot of things memorized, and a lot of things came through music, and they knew ballads and et cetera, right? So you can have a literary culture without necessarily being literate. So, it does seem that this was done. That was the second question. The third question, let's see, the first question was, to whom was it? Oh, was it, actually I skipped one, I'm sorry. One was, would it be the same people from the morning and the evening? The answer is mostly yes. So they would have seen it. Again, all Thomas has to do is, like, you remember in the morning, he'll say, this morning we talked about Ecce, Rex, and I said blah, 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 blah. And he can sum it up in one paragraph. Okay, like 2 sentences, and then off he goes. Now, next, and people, it does to be like, okay, next you've got tuus, and the point is, but everybody be like, oh yeah, he's got the next word he's got to do. Yeah. And you can tell, it's interesting, in a couple of sermons where Thomas clearly, and Bonaventure's around, Thomas clearly ran short of time because he's he's got, like I've developed with number 1, number 2, number 3, the third word, or again, some you don't have to have one word, you can have, 2 words. Anyway, and he gets to the fourth and he's like, well, we're lacking time here. So he gets 2 sentences and he's out. And it's clear, like, oh my God, the time is coming, right? I've talked too long. I don't have time to develop my little fourth part. And he just, he just phones it in. I mean, you're like, okay, bye, have a good day. No, he doesn't say that. He says, let's say the prayer, thank God for this, et cetera, et cetera. And it's clear that he probably had a whole bunch of development that he had to do, and he just didn't get to it.
Okay. Did you get the third? Wait, did you get the third question in there too?
Which was
what were the also were these sermons collected by Thomas himself?
Oh, yeah, that was another question. I'm sorry, that was one other. I thought I'd gotten through 3, but there was a fourth. No, there were masters like Bonaventure who actually made a collection of all their sermons, or their confreres did. But Bonaventure seems to have actually gathered together a whole group of his sermons to serve as a kind of model sermon guide. Thomas never did that, right? And so that's why his sermons are kind of all over the place. And, they had to be identified through a very complex process of critical addition. And we only have like 21 of them, as I said, and not all of those are even complete. Some of them are really just very bare, minimal stuff. But so no, he never, it seems, not that we know of, we never see of anything, and we don't have anything like that. Whereas, like, you can go with St. Bonaventure, and there is even an English translation, it's really wonderful, called The Sunday Sermons of St. Bonaventure, and that was the thing he made. In fact, scholars think that he may have actually not delivered all those sermons, that he actually he wanted to have one for every week of the year. And so he delivered some of them, right? But then when he wasn't delivering one, he just wrote one anyway, because he wanted to have a complete collection, of all of the weeks of the year through all the seasons. But anyway, but again, Thomas never did that.
All right. Okay.
He's busy with other stuff. Maybe I argue in my book that Thomas is good and he's clear, but he's the title I give him in the book from Cambridge University Press is The Logician Who Learned to Preach, right? Thomas is trained in logic and natural philosophy and, high-level theology, et cetera, et cetera. He learned to preach. Bonaventure, by the same token, is the scholastic with the soul of a poet, right? He spent 14 years at the University of Paris, and this is what they trained you to do at the University of Paris, and it shows. He's very, very good at this. I mean, elegant, so elegant, it's a little too complicated. In the same way, if you read the sermons of Bernard of Clairvaux, right, John, you've read some sermons, Bernard's sermons are beautiful, amazing, but they're so complicated in their imagery, it spins your head around. And Bonaventure is the same way.
So, who was the intended audience of Bernard's sermons? Do we know that? Were those popular?
Well, monks.
Yeah. The monks.
Yeah, he's preaching just, regularly. And again, you can see he's working his way through, like the famous Sermon on Song of Songs. And he's just working his way through. And you get to like Sermon 5 or 6 or 7, and you're still talking about, kiss me with a kiss of your mouth, which is the first line of the first song from the Song of Songs. Yeah. And you're like, God, when's he going to get through this thing? And it's like, 4 volumes or something, and he finally gets through it. But that kind of thing, which was so popular among the monastic crowd, and what we usually associate with biblical commentary and some verse by verse thing, just wasn't popular in the late 12th. I mean, it started to become popular in the early 13th century. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they developed this style, probably mostly around Paris, as far as we can tell. And it spread, and people liked it. And it spread up to England. That's the way people preach in England too, for about 150 years, and then it dies out.
Yeah. Okay, next question. This is an interesting question. And having been a seminary professor, and also obviously I still have a lot of good friends who, as I'm sure you do, Dr. Smith, that are working in seminaries. I can really attest to this. It's not everywhere, but it's some places. many places. What went wrong? Is it possible to pinpoint when the art of preaching? Okay, so there's two questions I'm going to put into one. Somebody asked what went wrong. Is it possible to pinpoint when the art of preaching started to dwindle? But then let's just add that another question so we can knock them both out because they're similar. Why are our modern priests not trained to spend the time preparing their homilies? And Randy, I mean, I remember in seminary, there are some seminaries that do a great job. I know the Dominicans in Washington, D.C. do a lot of work on rhetoric and all this kind of stuff. But I know in many seminaries, it's like, all right, we got to get somebody to teach Christology and Trinity and the sacraments and moral theology. All right, well, who's left who can teach homiletics? Right. I mean, this is the attitude, really. And then we wonder why guys come out and, unless they have a natural or, kind of a natural ability at oratory, well, So what do you think?
Right. And of course, the notion that you would have a class, right, that would be like, well, there's Christology and there's Trinity and there's soteriology, and so then here's a class in homiletics. And the point is, we don't exactly teach people how to preach in quite the same way that you teach them about Christ. And I think most classes in homiletics don't, in a way. We know they're practical, but again, anybody who understands the rhetorical tradition knows that you think you're going to teach these kids to, like these young men to preach in one semester class, right? If you think that, okay, it's like, I don't think you understand the nature of oratory and how difficult it can be. And I think, again, John, as you said, when you sort of assign some person that you don't really, whatever, and you say, oh, yeah, do homiletics. You need a course in homiletics. It shows you don't care. And, we get this all the time, for example, about liturgy from our Eastern Orthodox brethren, right? They're scandalized all the time that, it's kind of like, don't you spend all your time learning how to do the Mass and working on liturgy and thinking about liturgy and the importance of liturgy? And of course, the point is, we had a course in it. It's kind of like, a course? Your whole life should be liturgy, right? That's how they teach theology. That's how they think all the time is liturgically. And there's pros and cons to that. But again, the point is like, is it really the source and summit of the Christian life, as Sacrosanctum Concilium says, the liturgical celebration? And is this really the word of God? And if it is, and this is really the central thing in the church, then why are you putzing around with it? Right. So I don't know. Look, pinpointing when it became a problem. This isn't the only time, by the way, that this has been a problem in the church. It's constantly a problem in the church because it requires training. And I show or argue or say and this is generally accepted in the book on from Cambridge University Press on the scholastic culture, that one of the things that drives the education at the University of Paris to be the way it is precisely the interest in training preachers to go out. Because you got to understand that, and I hadn't understood this before I started to do this research, that, there's a good number of centuries in the church where on a Sunday at Mass or a daily Mass, whatever, but there's no preaching going on whatsoever. Right?
Right.
Like only the bishop might be preaching at the cathedral, and even then, not always. So you have these guys in the early 13th century who are like, at Paris, who are saying, okay, I want all my priests to actually preach on Sunday. You got to give a homily. And this is what the Franciscans and Dominicans were founded to do, was to go out and preach. And you're like, well, because the preaching was lousy? I mean, yes, but also because the preaching was non-existent. You had a lot of illiterate people who became priests, and, they kind of knew how to do the Mass, but preaching doctrinally correct, rhetorically interesting, learned kind of stuff was not something most priests then or now can do, as it requires, a certain kind of learning and a certain kind of attention to it. And this is something that was developed in the 13th century, right? But again, those cultural, that's why Charlemagne called Alcuin of York down to his capital, in France, à La Chapelle, because, Aachen, as the Germans know it, right? Because he wanted to start a school, because he wanted people to preach, wanted people to be able to read the scriptures and preach, because most people were not being preached to. So, these traditions go up and they go down, and in some places it's better. Again, I have among my Calvinist brethren, they have a much higher general standard of preaching that they came into the 20th century.
Let me follow up with that. So you mentioned Aachen. That's a really fascinating point. I didn't know that's was one of these kind of driving influences of Charlemagne. So what was the state? Do we know what the state of, say, Benedictine preaching was as England converted and they moved into the mainland and they moved into Germany? I mean, was there an ethos? Was there a style? How much do we know about that from, say, the 7th to 11th century or something?
Well, there are people who've done work on that, but I am not as aware of that period right now. I'm aware. Let me put it this way, a bit. Okay, we're academics. We never want to say we don't know something, but here's where the issue that you asked me before comes up. We read stuff in manuscript, like people have discovered manuscripts. And so, for example, we have the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, okay, who's early 12th century stuff. So, okay, fine. And then you have others, and so I've read some sermons here, some, things, speeches that were delivered and whatever. And then you ask the precise question that the Michael asked, right? I think, which is to say, well, was this what was being preached like out in the countryside, or when people came? And the answer is, well, that I couldn't tell you because I don't know, right? And even with the 13th century stuff, it remains a kind of a dispute. Okay, like there's still plenty of people who can't believe that like that kind of sermon out for the regular laity, in some rural village in Italy or something like that. Really, is that what you're suggesting? And of course, then there's the issue of Latin. Would they have understood Latin? Would they have done it in Latin? The answer is no. Anyway, so look, there's a lot more to be said about this, a lot more to be done. You have to understand still, it's the case that most of the texts from the Middle Ages have not been recovered. Some of them exist in manuscript form, and those manuscripts haven't been chronicled, looked through.
Dr. Evans, we need to get Dr. Evans back on this. Things are. Yeah.
Look, in other words, it's something that requires a lot more work, right? To figure out precisely that kind of question. To what extent, what was the preaching like out in the rural countryside? What was its relationship to Benedict and stuff? Was there any preaching at all? Because again, look, if there's no one preaching at all, you're not getting manuscripts, right? And then the manuscripts you're getting are only the best stuff, or, like monasteries may keep this stuff, but then probably only the stuff that their own people in the monastery are preaching. Anyway, so and the bottom line though is that I simply don't really have any sense of that.
Yeah.
The question you're asking.
Okay, let me follow up on that. This is just my own question. This isn't somebody else's question. What about this? I haven't read extensively, but I've kind of perused through them. The sermons in St. Francis's Omnibus. Were those his sermons, or were those? I can't remember if those were sermons.
So I haven't looked at St. Francis's Omnibus. It's interesting, right? Yeah. I can tell you all the stuff about Bonaventure, right? But I assume that the stuff in Francis's Omnibus was all Francis. I mean, you can look at the notes in the volume. I've glanced at Francis. Again, here's the problem with that. First of all, Francis, it's clear Francis is not preaching in this style.
Yeah.
Right. So having specialized in this sermon whatever style, having particularly interested in Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, which is kind of high stuff, I know when it started, who started it, how it, around Paris, et cetera, et cetera. I know that neither Dominic nor Francis would have done it this way. All right. But haven't read enough Dominic or Francis to know,
right.
Anything authentic. Because, John, part of the issue is then you might read something, as people did with Thomas's sermons. They were like, oh, Thomas's sermons are right. And the point is like, yeah, that's not authentic.
Right.
Right. So I just had this yesterday with Father Kevin Flannery. I had said something in a paper, and he rightly came back to me and he said, well, that was in the Collatio of, and that was a reportatio. So that phrase that Thomas used there might not have been the actual phrase he used. And I was like, yeah, no, you're right. I know. Anyway, so you get all these sort of complexities, and they're all legitimate, but then you have to make certain generalizations. But
Right.
I mean, it's better just simply to say, look, we there's certain things we just don't know.
Right. So
Right.
okay, let me ask you kind of in that 13th century milieu. I've told you this before. This is why I'm excited about your new book, because I think it does some of this. I'm still waiting for somebody to write in English, this kind of intellectual theological history, this kind of dynamic integrated thing like they used to do. Of Paris, of 13th century Paris, because of course you had the Dominicans right there, you had the Franciscans not too far away, you had the
Victorines,
Victorine, and of course they were all knocked down in the French Revolution. But could the average person, being a modern historical theologian, I mean, if you could, how much access did the average people did the Parisians have? Do we even know that? How much in terms of hearing sermons in the churches, or were these just for the?
Well, again, we know they heard sermons in churches because was the interest of the Fourth Lateran Councils. They start to preach, and we know that there were orders that were put out. Everybody's got to preach, and they preached this way. How much? As you know, there's two kinds of historians. There's the historians that do intellectual history stuff, among which I generally am, and you are, like interested in ideas. Then there's what they used to call the pig counters, and that's a little unfair. But the people who go and count the number of pigs that a farmer in rural England had, and which is important because it's kind of like, well, how big were these farms? We talking about a farm with 3 pigs or a farm with 12 pigs, and it's kind of fascinating. And actually, if you study some of this stuff, you realize one thing that people didn't realize: women actually bought and sold land in England. You could inherit land as a woman, and there are women who buy and sell farms, and peasants. There's always this thing about peasants, and they're like, well, you see, the peasants, that's a lower class and whatever. They buy and sell land too, actually. So the whole easy structure of the feudal world isn't as easy. And anyway, but you only discover that with these great historians that go and count all the pigs. And so the point is, I don't know. The churches, people go to church, and it's a big deal. Obviously, they give money. They fill up, the cathedral at Chartres and at Notre Dame in Paris, and they're hearing preaching, if that's your question. Now, about Paris, how many people are going to these particular academic sermons? That I can't really tell you. Although, Paris has got a lot of students.
Mm-hmm.
Have a look, but again, not like 50,000 like the University of Wisconsin, at Madison or something. Okay, like it's not that big. Okay, there aren't cities that are that big. Right. Okay, Paris is the biggest city there is in Europe, and it's not yet. It's just barely getting to be about 1 million.
Right.
Right. But, how many at the University of Paris? That's another good question. And the truth is, I don't know how many students you would be talking about.
Another question that's interesting, and I'm sure maybe we don't know, is, of course, the precursor to this is the Cathedral School at Notre Dame. So you'd think that there would be, Abelard, and, that there would be some crossover, and they would be actually preaching in the cathedral, right?
No, and you think there's got to be something, because if any of this was done in the aula, the hall of the bishop, it must have drawn some sort of audience, right? And that, anyway, and a lot of these manuscripts were saved, and so you got to presume that it was a thing. So, for example, you would ask that, John, about Bonaventure's Collationes that he gave later in his life, on the 6 days of creation, and on the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, and on the 10 commandments. Anyway, so he did these things at the University of Paris. And of course, we have those texts. And, again, who would come to them? And the answer is, I suppose anybody could. That part of your question is, who was allowed to come? And the answer is, well, I think anybody, but who would actually come? Well, it's sort of like this lecture. Who's allowed to come? Anybody, right? I mean, you're all welcome.
RealTheologyUST.com. There you go.
No, but how many people come? I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm just kind of like, how many people are interested in medieval sermons or something? Like, I don't know. I am kind of, but I got interested because it was Thomas Aquinas largely. I didn't really get interested in medieval sermons. I just was like, oh, Thomas Aquinas, it's his sermons. I should read this. And I started reading it and thought, this is really weird. Like, Thomas is a genius. What's he doing? Like, this is nuts. And then I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole method to this madness. And it was something that became interesting to me. And then I sort of thought, oh, these guys are more literary once you start to read their prologues and their preaching.
Right.
They're a lot more literary than people gave them credit for. Because here's the point, everybody needs to understand this, as you know, like in history. People have read the disputations because they're interested in arguments. But then, but they did, when you're a master, that is something you did, but you also engaged in preaching and lectio. And so biblical commentary only in the last 20 years has started to become a thing where people are reading medieval biblical commentary. And preaching almost nil. And so I was like, well, nobody's done it. So I didn't do it for that. I just was Thomas Aquinas. And I just thought, I want to understand how Thomas writes sermons. And so that's why I wrote that book. But then while I was involved in that, I started to sort of look at Bonaventure to compare certain things. And I realized, oh, wow, Bonaventure's really good.
Yeah.
and he's smart. And then I thought it was interesting because that's why I wrote the book, kind of, because here's two guys who were at the University of Paris at roughly the same time.
Yeah.
Who had a very different educational background, but they're all sort of trained in Paris and trained in this style. And the results are very different. They're very unique, right? They're two guys who come through the same kind of educational training, but the results and the minds that they produced and the style that was produced is radically different. Which suggests the same education, even if you have the same kind of formation education, it won't necessarily produce little clones.
Yeah, right.
It produces two people who are both saints of the church, amazing guys, but who have very, very, very different ideas about things. And Bonaventure, of course, is mostly wrong, but anyway, as we all know, because
all right.
Bonaventure's great. It's just when you get to Scotus that oh.
Yeah, right. Of course, the journey of the mind to God is it's great, kind of noble, rhetoric in preparation for the real meat of the Summa.
Actually, the thing I'm writing now, John, just as a finish up, is that is a thing on the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum. That's what you're talking about, right? The journey of the mind into God, which the gist of the book is that if you read the Itinerarium through the lens of medieval preaching, right? Once you become aware of the methods of medieval preaching, that I was talking about divisio and dilatatio. Okay, once you start to start to read these manuals and stuff like that, and you read Bonaventure's sermons, you think, oh yeah, you can see how the style is. Then you read the Itinerarium, and then you're like, oh yeah, it makes much more sense.
Right.
And actually, the other thing I argue is, because it's a very complicated text in all sorts of ways. Once you understand it in terms of medieval preaching, right, the style I'm telling you about, it's much easier to remember it. It's actually quite memorable.
Right.
Even though it's bizarrely complicated, but if you had that medieval training, you would be able to, again, you can see it actually, as you know, because it's all cataloged according to the six wings of the seraph. Right. So the first two go together, and then the second two go together, and there's just a whole set of images that Bonaventure uses. It's very, very characteristic of medieval preaching.
Dr. Smith, it's 9:17 in South Bend. Do you have time for one more question?
Oh yeah, what have I got to do?
Can we get you to delay your nightcap just a little bit longer?
My nightcap, yeah.
Okay.
My huge glass of bourbon and ice cream or something. Anyway, I don't know what my nightcap would be. I've never had a nightcap anyway.
Okay, let's see here. Well, a couple of comments. Great presentation, very relevant in retaining church membership. Also, wow, he's really calling it like it is in today's preaching. Yeah, Dr. Smith, that's not right to really let loose. No, okay, here's the question though. Okay, do some preachers in this day and age need to simplify their homilies because of the audience, or because of kind of the low level of catechesis in their audience, and do they need to simplify their preaching?
Because you have to think about your audience. So I don't know, right? I'm not a priest. I don't have congregations, et cetera, but I know priests. Okay. And as far as I can tell, right? Oh, well, let me back up one step. tend to be a person who doesn't like dumbing down, right? I don't like sort of underestimating the congregation. Okay, congregations in modern America, you're looking at a crowd of people, oftentimes now, it wasn't always true, but now, who have PhDs in law and medicine, and they've all gone to college and they've read Shakespeare, et cetera, because that's American educational system. And I just think it's going to be hard to kind of again, I think too complicated comes when you don't fully understand the doctrine, actually. And again, John, you would probably, one of the problems in seminaries oftentimes is people are like, yeah, this stuff in theology and philosophy, I just need to go out and be a priest. And the point is like, what do you think you're going to talk to people about?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's complicated because they don't, particularly when you get to Trinity Sunday and you start to hear homilies about Trinity Sunday, you're like, dude, this could be a lot easier, but you just don't understand the doctrine at all. And so you're messing this up. And you've read some weird stuff on the Google, you've Googled something. And anyway, so that's a bad idea. But I usually don't think of like simplifying. But in other words, if everybody preached like C.S. Lewis writes, we'd feel like we died and gone to heaven, and that, of course, isn't the medieval style at all. But plenty of people read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and all his, his essays and his books and stuff. And they're like, oh, this is wonderful. And the point is it's not exactly baby prose or anything, right? So, and again, I have a friend who's a Calvinist preacher at a small church up in Michigan, and rural people, et cetera, and he has a very learned kind of preaching style that they seem to love.
Yeah.
Because he's obviously very earnest about the scriptures and stuff. He's not talking about, and he's read all this stuff, German theologians and, modern commentaries on social decay and stuff like that. He's got it all in his mind. We talk all the time, and he's quite brilliant. But, he doesn't preach on it. He preaches in the Bible.
Yeah.
He tells them about, the travels through the desert. He talks to them about Jesus and the, Cana. And it's just very, very biblical. And he works on it, to try to make it clear and to try to make it very, we might say, literary, rather than, highly literate or something.
Yeah.
And it takes, that's the other thing you understand. It usually takes somebody who's like C.S. Lewis or like my friend, who's very, very smart to sound simple.
Yeah.
Usually complexity comes because people don't really get it and don't really understand. And of course, we'd have to get people out of the Toastmasters mentality. It's very clear, right? Like start with a little story, start with a joke.
Yeah.
Warm up the crowd. Everybody's like, oh, here.
Oh, yeah. If they could just teach that, like, don't start with a joke.
Don't start with a joke. I'm not saying never start with a joke, but the point is mostly don't ever start with a joke. And a personal story, right, is like, again, I'm not saying never do it, but it's kind of like, oh, here comes the personal story. We have this group up here, and that's clearly what they're taught. Always start with a personal story, because it's kind of like, okay, here comes the personal story. Right. We used to have a guy here who's always mentioned somewhere and usually started with something from Peanuts, like Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
Well, in Peanuts, it'd be like, oh my God, this is his style. He thinks this is like, everybody loves him because he mentions Peanuts every single homily. Anyway.
Speaking of the anti-intellectual attitude in seminaries, this is a real thing. There's a lot. It's pervasive in all seminaries. Seminary professors bang their heads because the guys just want to get through. I just want to get through these courses, and I just want to go be a priest. It's like, oh, I just want to be John Vianney, sitting. And I actually had one seminary.
Also, writing. Here's another thing: no reading, no writing. The only way you're going to learn to preach is if you read and write. And we've talked to people who are teachers and tutors and whatever in seminaries, and there's just been there's a lot of plagiarizing. And a lot of not doing writing assignments, and a lot of people kind of saying, well, get them through. And the point is, okay, and what kind of preachers are they going to be? They're going to be really like we've got. And there's a lot of reasons for that, actually. The question of your questioner, look, there's a whole, as you know, John, there's a whole history about, ethnic divisions in the United States and different sort of liturgical traditions. And one big element was the German, which is a very high liturgical style, and another was the Irish, which you got to understand. The Irish came through a period, obviously, in their history when they had liturgy, but you couldn't sing or do anything, right? Because it was illegal to be Catholic in Ireland, right, for a long period of time, okay, when the English took over. And so that kind of puts the kibosh on your liturgical liveliness in certain ways. And, when an immigrant culture in the United States, largely coming, et cetera, language issues, whatever, that high level tradition. And the other thing I've noticed, because I didn't grow up Catholic, I've seen among Catholics that, when you read John Henry Newman, there's plenty of Catholics who are like, yeah, Englishman, right? That's Anglican, okay? So it would be interesting to talk to Bishop Lopes about this, and that, you look at the Anglican ordinariate, and there's still plenty of Catholics who'd be like, ooh, that's Anglican. And that's our, they oppressed us. That's too, they sort of looked at all the Oxford, Cambridge. It's like, that's not us.
Yeah.
Right. Which I'm sad. But again, look, I didn't live through that, and it's not my tradition. But, it's very sad to go to Oxford and Cambridge, see all these beautiful chapels that are now kind of emptying out in the colleges. And then you go see the Catholic, what do we call it? Oratory. It's ugly as god awful ugly, as you can possibly imagine. Have you ever been to Oxford and seen the Catholic the oratory there?
Yeah.
Ronald Knox did his work and stuff. It's all 70s. It looks like a boat. The inside of a ship. They've actually fixed it up over the last 10 years or something, but it's just an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
If you're an Anglican and you become a Catholic in England, what you have to give up in terms of beauty and culture, is just tremendous. Anyway.
Right.
And you go out to, we have Our Lady of Walsingham. You go to Walsingham and you see the Anglican Church at Walsingham. It's actually quite nice, interesting in a lot of ways. Some people don't like it, but it's very ancient, traditional in a lot of ways. Then you go over to see the Catholic chapel, and it's just it's a misery. What the Protestants couldn't do to us, we did to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Well, when you start, inviting Le Corbusier to design your churches, you know where that's going to end up.
Or his disciple Philip Johnson, then that might be a problem.
Okay, all right.
Wait a minute. Oh,
now
Philip Johnson.
Okay, well, that's why we shift gears now.
I know he's good. That was all fine. He was not a communist or a Nazi.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about back on the preaching thing was, I was in this kind of this anti-intellectual attitude and you're so right, is that, especially seminarians come in, this gets back, if that person who asked this question is still on here, you ask him, where did things go wrong? I mean, a lot of guys that join the seminary come from a hard science background, or they're engineers or something. And those guys just don't learn to write. And so, I remember I actually had at a lunch table in the refectory, I had a seminarian look at me, and dead serious. I was hoping, that there was going to be he was going to crack a grin at the end, as if to say he said, people don't want you to prepare sermons. They don't want that. He goes, they want it from the heart. They want it to mean something. Yeah. So what you do is you just right before the sermon, you just open it up, you read the gospel, and whatever comes to you, you just let it rip. And I looked at him thinking, so you clearly are not very in touch, because people are really dying for, as you say, a more elevated message. They're thirsting for it, right? So,
I don't know what to say to that guy other than, again, in homiletics class, we'll film you, and you got to watch yourself, and you tell me whether you think you said anything that, and then we'll ask 5 people who listen to this thing and see whether they thought right. And we'll try to get them to be honest. And if they are honest, they'll go, I'm sorry, dude, but again, I don't know what to say. Like, look, it's kind of like when people have this idea about art but they fortunately don't have it anymore about music. It's sort of like, look, you don't learn to play the guitar. You just get emotive, and then you just sit down, and then you just like strum, or so. It's like, dude, the true passion of the thing only comes when you've actually mastered the art. Then you can be creative. Otherwise, what you've got is just a mess. right? And nobody wants to hear, I mean, and the notion that somehow your emotive mess is somehow worth the time of all these people who came to Mass is just arrogant beyond words, right?
Right.
You think you can just, like, I'm just gonna get in touch with my inner, gestalt or something, and then I'll just let it rip. And this is gonna impress, a room full of people. I'm sorry, but you're just arrogant if you think that. And you're just wrong if you think that. I'm not saying no one ever in their lives could do it, but if you think that's the way great homilies are done, or anybody who actually produced anything, or Shakespeare, or, any great poet, they just kind of like, you just produce it. I'm married to a poet. You don't produce poetry that way. You don't produce music that way. Mm-hmm. You don't just like get a spirit, you learn the art, you work hard. So, it's just this notion that somehow great art comes from just emoting. And the truth is it never does.
Yeah. Dr. Smith, it has been a real pleasure, and what a fascinating research you're doing. There's so much food for thought. We really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And, thanks to Miss, how do you pronounce Adele's last name? I never asked her last name.
Menezes? What's that? Menezes.
Menezes.
Yes.
And then Karina, and, thank them both for, actually coming and being here. And I suppose there's other people we can't see. But anyway, no, thank you guys very much. And medieval sermons. Now you know something. As I said, however much you care or don't care about medieval sermons, you now know something that almost no one in the world actually knows. Because there are very few people interested in medieval sermons. And the point is, if they start to read them, you'll find people are like, they're just weird. I tried to read this sermon by Thomas Aquinas, but it's like he's reading all sorts of weird things into the text. You ever see it? And the point is, now he's not. It's a mnemonic device. And once you explain to them it's a mnemonic device, and they go, oh, wait a minute. And they look through it and they're like, oh, it is. Okay. Then it all starts to make sense. They're like, well, that's kind of ingenious. They're like, yeah. But very few people actually kind of know that. So something that very few people in the world.
No, it's fascinating, and I hope many people buy your book.
For what it's worth, right?
The Beginner's Guide and the next one. So next week, everybody, we hope you join in, because if you remember, last week was Father Raphael Mary, and he started this part 1 of the soul. We have a 2-part series on what is the soul. So Father talked about what is a soul from the Thomistic perspective. Next week, we have his colleague, Dr. David Squires, who is talking also about the soul. And I'm going to, I have very high level graphic design team. There it is right there. The soul, my design team, the soul in the Aristotelian tradition, is it outmoded? An online lecture by David Squires, June 30th, 7 p.m. So we hope you all join us next week. Dr. Smith, it's been a real pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful summer up in South Bend, and I will see you in August.
Yeah, or before, whatever. Anyway, so take care, John.
Thanks.
Yeah, John. All right, bye.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate it.
Yeah.